They said a mother's love is equal for all her children, but Grace proved them wrong. In a quiet village in Enugu State, where the sound of crickets filled the night and the scent of roasted corn floated through the air, there was a woman named Grace, her husband Daniel, and their 2 daughters, Mary and Ruth. Their house stood at the edge of the dusty road, small but neat, with flower pots made from old paint buckets and chickens scratching the ground near the doorstep. To strangers, the family seemed happy and blessed, but inside there was a wound no one could see. Mary, the first daughter, was light-skinned, graceful, and gentle. She always obeyed. Her mother adored her. Ruth, on the other hand, was darker, bold, and full of questions. Grace often called her stubborn and disrespectful. When visitors came, Grace would beam with pride, saying, "Meet my jewel, Mary. She's going to be a doctor." She never mentioned Ruth unless forced to. Daniel, the father, noticed the imbalance and tried to speak up. He said, "Grace, you must love both equally. God doesn't bless favoritism." But Grace would wave him off. She said, "You don't understand, Daniel. Mary listens. That one," she pointed at Ruth, "has the devil's stubbornness." From that day, love in that home stopped being shared. It became selective. And what began as a mother's bias would soon grow into a tragedy that no one could reverse.
Ruth grew up knowing she was unwanted. She saw it in her mother's eyes each time she tried to speak. If Mary made a mistake, Grace would laugh it off. But when Ruth made the same mistake, the house shook with shouts and slaps. One evening, Grace cooked vegetable soup and placed the biggest piece of meat in Mary's plate. Ruth got bones. Daniel, noticing it, sighed and quietly slipped his own piece into Ruth's bowl when Grace wasn't looking. "Eat, my daughter," he whispered. Ruth smiled weakly. That small act of kindness meant more to her than words could describe. At school, Ruth was sharp, curious, and full of ideas. But her confidence slowly faded. Each time her mother insulted her, she began to believe she was truly worthless. When Mary got a scholarship, Grace slaughtered a chicken and called the neighbors to celebrate. When Ruth came home second in her class, Grace barely looked up. "Second?" she said. "Try to be like your sister." That night, Ruth lay awake listening to the crickets and her sister's soft breathing. Tears soaked her pillow. "God," she whispered, "why did you give me a mother who can't love me?" But the heavens were silent, just as silent as her mother's heart.
Years passed. Mary gained admission into the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. The whole village rejoiced. Grace wore her best lace wrapper to church and testified, "My daughter will be a doctor," she shouted proudly. The congregation clapped, unaware that her other daughter sat at the back, fighting tears. Ruth's own dream of schooling died quietly. Grace said there was no money left. She said, "Your sister's education must come first. You can manage at home." So Ruth began selling palm oil in the village markets. She woke early, carried heavy jerry cans, and stood under the scorching sun. Sometimes her hands trembled from exhaustion, but she smiled through the pain. When she made her first 5,000 naira, she ran home with excitement. "Mama, look, I made this from my business."
Grace barely glanced at her. "That's good," she said dryly. "Maybe you'll stop depending on me." Then she turned to Mary's framed photo on the wall and smiled proudly. From that day, Ruth stopped sharing her joys. Her laughter disappeared. She spoke less, smiled less, and built walls around her heart. Walls even love would let her struggle to break.
3 years later, the yellow bus that stopped at the junction carried a surprise. Mary had returned, and she wasn't alone. A shiny car followed behind. Out stepped a tall, handsome man in a suit, holding her hand. "Mama," Mary said proudly, "meet my fiancé, Dr. Kelvin." The neighbors gathered, shouting praises. "Your daughter will soon be married to a doctor." Grace was overwhelmed with pride. "God has done it," she shouted, dancing in circles. That night, she cooked jollof rice, fried plantain, and brought out her hidden bottle of wine. She didn't even notice that Ruth ate alone in the corner, her eyes glistening with sadness. When Ruth tried to greet Kelvin politely, her mother snapped, "Don't disturb them. Go and fetch water." Ruth said nothing, but Kelvin noticed the tension. That night, he asked Mary, "Your sister, why does your mother treat her like that?" Mary hesitated. It's complicated," she said quietly. "Mama just believes I'm easier to love." Outside, Ruth sat alone, staring at the stars. The laughter from inside echoed painfully in her ears. "God, when will I ever be enough?" A week later, Ruth went to deliver palm oil to a new client at a private hospital in town. As she entered the reception area, she froze. There, standing by the corridor, was Dr. Kelvin, but not with her sister. He was holding another woman's hand, a pregnant woman. They looked happy, whispering and laughing as he rubbed her belly. Ruth's heart dropped. She quickly hid behind a pillar, trembling. She couldn't believe what she saw. When they walked past, she overheard the woman say, "I can't wait for you to finally tell your wife the truth." Kelvin smiled and kissed her forehead. "Soon, my love, I promise." Ruth's mind went blank. How could she tell her sister? How could she even tell her mother, who worshipped Kelvin as if he were an angel? She went home in shock, unable to sleep all night. By morning, she knew what she had to do. Even if no one believed her, she had to tell them the truth. "Mama," Ruth began carefully the next morning, "there's something I need to tell you about Kelvin." Grace was sweeping the compound, humming. She stopped and frowned. "What nonsense are you talking about this early morning?" Ruth took a deep breath. "I saw him yesterday with another woman, a pregnant woman. He told her he would leave his wife soon. Mama, please." Grace's broom fell from her hand. "Ruth, you will not destroy my daughter's happiness because of jealousy. So, because your sister is marrying a doctor, you want to spoil it?" "Mama, I swear I'm not lying," Ruth cried, her voice trembling. But Grace's voice rose in anger. "You are evil. I have always known it. You hate your sister's success because you're a failure yourself." Mary came out from the room, confused. "What's happening?" she asked. Grace turned to her. "Your sister wants to destroy your wedding with lies." Mary looked at Ruth, her eyes full of disappointment. "I thought you'd be happy for me," she said softly. Then she walked away. Ruth's tears fell like rain. She whispered, "One day the truth will speak for itself." The wedding day came with joy, music, and sunshine. The church was decorated with white and gold ribbons. Drums echoed as guests danced. Mary looked like a princess in her gown. Grace couldn't stop smiling, her pride shining brighter than her jewelry. The pastor began the vows. If anyone has a reason why these two should not be joined, speak now or forever hold your peace. The crowd was silent until a voice broke the air. I have a reason. Everyone turned. A heavily pregnant woman stood at the door, breathing heavily. That man is my husband, she screamed. Gasps filled the room. Mary's bouquet fell from her hand. Kelvin's face turned white. The woman walked to the altar and threw photos on the floor, pictures of their traditional marriage, his messages, and ultrasound results. Chaos erupted. Guests shouted. Grace fainted. Kelvin collapsed in tears, her wedding ruined before her eyes. And as ushers dragged Kelvin out, Ruth stood frozen at the back, silent, heartbroken, and vindicated. The shame spread through the village like wildfire. People whispered, Grace's golden daughter was almost married to another woman's husband. At home, Grace couldn't stop crying. She wailed, how could this happen to me? Ruth sat quietly, her eyes swollen from tears. Mama, I tried to tell you, she said softly. Grace turned to her, trembling. I was blind, Ruth. I was so blind. Mary refused to come out of her room. She didn't eat for days. Daniel knocked on her door every night, begging her to open up. But she only said, Mama destroyed me. Ruth tried to comfort her sister, but the pain was too deep. Every sound in the house became heavy with regret. Grace barely slept, haunted by her daughter's voice screaming in the church. The woman who once favored one child had lost control of both.
It was raining heavily when tragedy struck. Daniel knocked on Mary's door, but there was no answer. He pushed it open and screamed. Mary lay lifeless on the floor, an empty bottle of pills beside her. Grace rushed in, screaming her name, shaking her body. Mary, my child, please wake up. But it was too late. The neighbors gathered, crying. The girl who was once the pride of her mother was gone. The sound of Grace's wailing filled the night. God, punish me, not her. Take me instead, she screamed, tearing at her clothes. Ruth knelt beside her mother, crying uncontrollably. Mama, I tried to save her. I tried. But no words could undo what had been done. One mother's blindness had cost her everything.
Months passed, but the house never recovered. Grace stopped wearing bright clothes. She stopped going to church. Every morning she sat under the mango tree, staring into nothingness. One evening, she called Ruth and held her hand. My daughter, she said weakly, I now understand. Love is not something to divide. I thought I was showing care, but I was feeding pride. I loved Mary too much and you too little, and in the end, I lost both. Ruth began to cry. Mama, I forgive you, she said softly, but I wish you had listened sooner. Grace nodded slowly. So do I, my child, so do I. From that day, she tried to love Ruth the way she should have loved her from the start. But even as she smiled again, her eyes always looked empty, like someone who lost half her soul. Moral of the story: a mother's love should be like the sun. It shines on all her children equally.
When love becomes favoritism, it destroys homes, divides hearts, and leaves behind regret that no prayer can erase.